All right, so Erev Tov from Jerusalem. Shalom to you all, wherever you are and whatever time zone you're in. You are most welcome to the second installment of the two-part webinar on the follow-up to the abortion ruling of the US Supreme Court. We were privileged to hear from Professor Elliot Dorff about traditional and liberal Jewish perspectives and sources, and we are in for a treat with Professor Noya Rimalt today. So Professor Rimalt, who is a law professor at the University of Haifa and a founding co-director of the Forum for Gender, Law and Policy, has been writing and speaking about these issues. And the intriguing, and I hope you all find it illuminating, the intriguing thing about her presentation is that in addition to providing us with a legal perspective of how abortion is treated in Israel, and provide a context to the comparison to the situation now in the US. When we spoke, what I realize is that she will give you a nuanced presentation or a nuanced perspective, because until I heard her, I thought that we fare very well, but it's a bit more complex. So her presentation will provide us with an understanding of where we stand in Israel on the law regarding abortion, and do women in Israel really fare well with regard to abortion? It seems that we have a long way to go yet, and Professor Rimalt will point out to us where exactly we need to go. So the microphone is yours. Toda rabba. We are, as in our webinars for quite a while now, fortunate to have as co-sponsors JPLAN, the Jewish Pluralism Legal Action Network, and I saw Mark Enshen, who is a co-chair, and I think Judge Buxbaum registered, and I don't remember if David Light has been able to register, and the Ruach Chidush, Rabbis and Cantors for Religious Freedom in Israel. Oh yes, Peter is here, good. And with the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists. So with these friends co-sponsoring the webinars, the stage and the microphone is yours, Noya.
Thank you very much, Uri, and thank you all for joining the discussion. I'm going to share my presentation, so it's going to make it a bit easier for everybody to follow everything that I'm going to say. With the end of Roe v. Wade, do Israeli women have it better? And today is a particularly interesting day to explore this question. Yesterday, it was exactly a month since the Supreme Court announced its decision in Dobbs, overturning Roe versus Wade. And immediately, 3 days later, the Minister of Health in Israel announced several abortion reforms, making the impression that while the United States is moving backwards in terms of abortion rights, Israel is moving in the opposite direction, in fact, making significant progress with regard to abortion rights. So what does the abortion law in Israel, what does it say? What is the current reality for women seeking abortion? And how Israel compares to the United States after the Dobbs decision. These are the questions that I want to explore today. And I want to start by discussing first the exact details of Israel's abortion law. So the current abortion law in Israel was enacted in 1977. It was enacted as part of the penal law. And what this law basically says, it imposes a criminal ban on abortion while allowing a three-person committee consisting of 2 doctors and a social worker to approve a request for abortion under one of several grounds. So the first possible ground for abortion is age-related. It determines that if the woman is under marriage age or over 40, the committee can then give her permission for abortion. The second possible ground for abortion relates to personal circumstances. It determines that if the pregnancy is the result of criminal, non-marital, or incestuous relations, again, another possible ground for abortion. The third ground for abortion focuses on potential fetus abnormalities. It determines that if the fetus is likely to have physical or mental defects, again, based on these grounds, the committee can give a woman a permission to have an abortion. And the fourth ground for abortion focuses on health considerations, and it determines that if the continuation of the pregnancy is likely to endanger the woman's life or cause her physical or mental harm, again, this is a possible ground for abortion. The original law, when it was enacted in 1977, included a fifth ground for abortion. This ground for abortion was known as the socioeconomic ground for abortion. However, this ground for abortion was repealed in 1980. At the time, it determined that if family or social conditions dictate the abortion, the committee could then grant permission for abortion. So if we're trying to summarize what are the central characteristics of Israel's abortion regulation, we should conclude first that there is no recognized right to abortion on demand. A woman has no control whatsoever over the decision whether she can have an abortion or not. This decision is granted to a committee, to a public committee. So access to abortion depends on committee's approval. And the legal grounds for abortion are relatively narrow. They don't include socioeconomic grounds. And this is really important to mention because in most instances, women seek to end an unwanted pregnancy because of socioeconomic reasons. And this is true, of course, not only for Israel, but for women around the globe. So how Israel ended up enacting this abortion law back in the 70s? The short answer is demographic concerns. And if you want a more detailed answer, I should mention first that the existing law back in the 70s, before abortion reform took place, this law imposed a strict criminal ban on all abortions. However, relevant figures at the time indicated that there was this very, very restrictive criminal legislation was mostly ignored. Black market abortions flourished. And basically, the state had no control whatsoever on the number of abortions performed each year. And this was a source for demographic anxiety for legislators and policy makers in Israel. And when I say demographic anxiety, you have to remember that back in the 70s, Israel was relatively a young state. It was surrounded by several hostile Arab nations with a population that outnumber the Jewish population in Israel. Also, the memories of the Holocaust were fresh with the loss of 6 million Jews. And policymakers in Israel felt that it is the duty of the Jewish state to make up for all these lost Jews. So when the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, when they embraced the committee model for abortion regulation, the expectation was that this model will be effective in restricting some abortions. They were hoping that the committees will not approve all abortions, and consequently, they will protect the country vital national interest in a population growth. So the idea that the state will gain control over the number of abortions performed each year, and this control will be gained through the operation of the pregnancy termination committees, and then the committees will not approve every request for abortion because of the limited grounds for abortion. But at the same time, in the early 70s, it was perceived as equally imperative to discourage high birth rates among poor Jewish families. Most poor Jewish families with high birth rates back then were Mizrahi families. And research data collected in the 60s and 70s showed a correlation between chronic problems of poverty and large families. So the idea behind the abortion reform was not simply population growth and increasing the Jewish population of Israel, but rather the goal was on the one hand to encourage family planning among the poor, as I said, mostly Mizrahi families, while on the other hand, promoting pro-birth policies among the more affluent. And the most intriguing aspect of this legal debate over abortion reform was that most proponents and opponents of abortion reform focused mostly on the demographic interest of the state of Israel, with hardly no right stock. And this is especially intriguing because we are talking about the mid-70s. Roe v. Wade has been just announced in the United States. Abortion has been conceptualized as a clear issue of rights. And still, legislators in Israel focused mostly on the demographic interest of the state of Israel when they debated abortion reform. And just to give you a sense of how demographic concerns actually unified both opponents and proponents of abortion reform. So let me give you just two quotes. The first quote from the Minister of Health back then, Victor Shem Tov. He was the initiator and a strong supporter of the reform. And when he was addressing his fellow members of Knesset, trying to convince them to support the proposed bill, he was talking about family planning, not abortion reform, right? Because this proposed reform was perceived as part of a larger package of proposed initiative that were trying to achieve a more proper balance with regard to family planning. So what he said to his fellow members of Knesset was family planning may lead families currently having 1 or 2 children to increase the number of children, while families having a multitude of children without having the ability to support and educate them might perhaps reach a more desirable plan for the family. And on the other side of the aisle, member of Knesset Yaakov Gross from the Religious Torah Front, and he was a fierce opponent of the proposed abortion reform, but he was still clinging to the same rhetoric, saying, what can we say to the world? On the one side, we invest billions to absorb Jews and to bring them to the land of Israel. But on the other side, we invest money to murder Jews. What is the logic in that? I cited here once the words of one Arab from the village of Sakhnin that said, until you bear one child, my wife bears 5 children. This is also true. This is also an argument, the demographic problem. So how come legislators in Israel back in the 70s were focusing on the demographic interests on the state of Israel while debating an issue such an abortion reform that clearly has such a huge impact on women's rights? The answer has to do with the specific legal and political context. Back then, Israel did not adopt a written constitution and the Bill of Rights upon its establishment. It was only in 1992 that the Knesset finally enacted 2 basic laws that now protect several human rights and are perceived as Israel's partial Bill of Rights. But this happened in 1992, as I said, and back in the 70s, and in the absence of a constitution and a Bill of Rights, legislators were not accustomed to considering the normative restraints of individual rights while formulating new legislation. A final development with regard to Israel abortion law occurred in 1980. And this was when the socioeconomic ground for abortion was repealed. As I already mentioned, this ground for abortion determined that if family or social conditions dictate the abortion, the committee could then give a woman permission to have an abortion. It was repealed because it attracted fierce religious opposition from the beginning, primarily from the ultra-Orthodox parties. The leaders of the ultra-Orthodox parties perceived this ground for abortion as a direct attack on their way of life. As you probably know, most ultra-Orthodox families have many children. These families are also very, very poor. So for the leaders of the community, this ground for abortion was perceived as a threat to their efforts to maintain high birth rates among women of their community, even in situations of social and financial hardship. So they put a lot of political pressure on the political establishment. They were finally successful in 1980 when this ground for abortion was repealed. And once it was repealed, abortion approvals were ultimately restricted to only 4 permissible grounds for pregnancy termination. And this final legal change had a disparate impact on married women. And to understand why, remember what I told you before. Among the different grounds for abortion, there is the non-marital ground that basically applies to single women. And so if you're single, if you're not married, so you have a potential recognized legal ground for abortion. But for married women, it is much harder. Usually, as I said, most women seek abortion because of socioeconomic reasons. Under the current framework of the law, married women have formal access to abortion only under age, health, or criminal circumstances. So in most instances, they don't have a formal legal ground for abortion. And that means that ever since the 80s, married women are forced to manipulate their way to legal abortion. And when I say to manipulate their way to legal abortion, to understand what exactly I mean, we need to be reminded of what the criminal abortion law actually says. So there are 4 grounds, possible grounds for abortion. The first and the third grounds for abortion cannot be manipulated. However, the second and the fourth ground can. So the non-marital ground for abortion applies not only to single women, it also applies to women who committed adultery, meaning women who come forward before the committee and declare that the pregnancy is not from their husband. So basically, this is what a married woman can do and does today. She comes forward, she declares that she committed an adultery, and then she can get a committee approval. The second ground for abortion that can be manipulated is the fourth ground that includes the mental harm ground for abortion. And here, what married women can do, they can declare that they are mentally unstable. They would usually need to be equipped with a psychiatric certificate for the right amount of money. You can get this psychiatric evaluation. So you're coming before the committee, you're declaring that you're mentally unstable, and then you get your permission to have an abortion. So basically, for married women, the most prevalent options to get a committee approval for abortion is to present themselves as either crazy or a adulteress. And just to give you a sense of what it looks like in reality, here is a testimony of a married woman who wanted to have an abortion a couple of years ago. And this is what she has to say. I'm married with children, and 4 years ago, we got into an unplanned pregnancy. We decided we could not have another child. It also involved economic considerations. When I realized I needed to see a committee, I was shocked. Financial constraints are not considered a justifiable reason for abortion. I had to get confirmation from a psychiatrist that I was mentally incompetent. I thought, what does this say about the children I have? I didn't want to go in that direction. In the end, I lied and I said I betrayed my husband. The social worker told me, do you understand the implications? She meant that if my husband wanted to divorce me, there is documented evidence that I allegedly betrayed him. She went on to say, are you lying? And I answered, you're pushing me against the wall. It is a terrible injustice that I have to beg for my body, to lie to get autonomy. I felt helpless. So if I need to summarize what is the reality for women seeking abortion in Israel, I think the best description would be that what we see here is the paradox of a rightless and degrading access to pregnancy termination. And when I say rightless and degrading access to pregnancy termination, I want to stress the fact that all women in Israel are treated as objects. All women depend on the public committee that determines their reproductive fate. All women have no control whatsoever over the decision whether they can end their own unwanted pregnancy. At the same time, once women are willing to play the rules of the games, they get access. So 99% of all requests for legal abortions are approved by the pregnancy termination committees. And if you ask why, I would say that the medical community in Israel understand that a woman who is seeking to end an unwanted pregnancy will get an abortion either way. So they would rather see women having abortions, safe abortions in public hospitals. And once abortion is approved by the committee, often it is funded by the state. However, the medical community can grant women permission to have abortion, but it cannot undo the shame and humiliation that are inherent to the committee process. So what we see here is a legal process that on the one hand enables abortion access, but on the other hand perpetuates women's status as second-class citizens. So you might ask, so what about the recent changes in Israel's abortion law that were announced by the Minister of Health? So I would answer that these were relatively very minor procedural reforms. And more specifically, what the minister was referring to was three procedural changes. The first procedural change has to do with medication abortion, and basically the new regulations now determine that a woman can have a medication abortion in a community clinic. So once she gets committee approval to have an abortion, she can go to her community clinic and not to a public hospital and have an abortion. A second procedural reform that has been promoted has to do with how you file your request for abortion. You can do it online now. You don't need to physically go to the nearest hospital. And finally, some intrusive and irrelevant questions were erased from the official application form. So these are good changes. They are certainly making it a bit better for women seeking abortion in Israel. However, the basic criminal committee legal framework remains unchanged. How can we promote change in Israel? How we can change this legal structure? Only by promoting legislative reform. We basically need to abolish the old abortion law and promote a new law. I drafted a proposal for abortion reform back in 2014. It was immediately submitted to the Knesset by then member of Knesset Zehava Galon, and then it was resubmitted and resubmitted over and over again. A new Knesset was elected. However, there was never a way to push forward this proposal for legislative reform. It is a very complex proposal. I will not discuss it in details. I will only mention two important features. And the first feature is that this bill proposes that the regulation of pregnancy termination in Israel will be done in a way that promotes gender equality and ensures a woman's right to her body, her right to health care and to liberty and human dignity. It also proposes to recognize a woman's right to abortion on demand in the first 13 weeks of pregnancy. How likely it is to promote this kind of legislative reform in Israel? I would say that it has been very difficult from the start, but after the court decision in Dobbs, it's becoming even harder. And this is because, in my opinion, Dobbs is a global event. It's not simply a local thing that happened in America. It is a global event, as I said, that has far-reaching consequences for women around the globe. And specifically, there are three immediate global implications to Dobbs: the constitutional implication, the strategic implication, and the democratic implication. And let me start with the constitution implication. And I would remind us all that Roe v. Wade was the first Supreme Court decision in the world that conceptualized abortion as a fundamental right. And it did so by determining that a woman's right to end an unwanted pregnancy is implicit in the concept of constitutional liberty. And this decision inspired court decisions throughout the years in many other countries and motivated women's groups to fight for a right-based legal definition on abortion. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the relatively recent court decision in Mexico or in Colombia, but clearly these decisions embrace the rhetoric and the rationale of Roe v. Wade. So the Dobbs decision actually takes back what gradually became accepted by courts and legislators in other countries. And this is the understanding that the constitutional right to liberty necessarily provides a solid protection for abortion rights. And Dobbs is happening and is being announced in an era when in most countries, abortion is still not recognized as a woman's fundamental right. So 64% of countries around the world, Israel among them, in these countries, activists are still fighting for a rights-based conceptualization of abortion. And it means that this decision threatens to disrupt ongoing global efforts to fill the gap between women's actual reproductive needs and formal recognized fundamental rights. What about the strategic implication of Dobbs? Again, I want to start by saying that the Dobbs decision is the worrying outcome of a long and sophisticated anti-abortion campaign. This campaign has started immediately after Roe v. Wade has been announced 50 years ago. And this campaign has been particularly successful because of several strategic choices made by anti-abortion activists. So first, they had a brilliant branding, pro-life, right? Presenting the other side as anti-life, as if being pro-life of women is not pro-life. This campaign also involved the promotion of countless anti-abortion legal measures that over the years curtailed the legal right to abortion long before Roe v. Wade was overturned. Eventually, it led to the hostile takeover of the Supreme Court. And of course, it involved the very successful spread of falsehoods about abortion. When I look at recent developments in Israel, I can already see how the religious right in Israel is employing similar tactics with donations that are coming from conservative forces in the United States. So, for instance, in recent years, several conservative bodies have been established trying to imitate the work of the Federalist Society in the US. This body focus on the Supreme Court, trying to promote the appointment of conservative judges. And more recently, we've been seeing some very vicious anti-abortion campaigns in Israel that are spreading distorted facts about abortion. Just to give you one example, I don't know how many of you can read Hebrew, but what this sign says, it says 40,000 children are being killed each year as a result of it. And but the real number of legal abortion in Israel every year is less than 18,000. And of course, not a single child have been killed as a result of abortion in Israel. And talking about falsehoods about abortion, this brings me to the third global implication of Dobbs, and this is the democratic implication. And I would say that the most troubling aspect in the majority opinion in Dobbs, in my opinion, is that it echoes and legitimizes some of the myths and falsehoods about abortion. And there are many examples, but I'll focus on only 3 examples. If you read the majority opinion written by Justice Alito, you see how he constantly refers to a child or a baby when he talks about abortion, basically erasing the scientific distinction between fertilized eggs, embryos, fetuses on the one hand, and full human beings on the other. And what is going on there is you see how the court is implicitly embracing the false narrative that abortion actually involves the murder of children. The second troubling narrative embraced by the court has to do with the number of late-term abortion. The court opinion creates a false impression that many abortions are performed in the 2nd and 3rd trimester, also many elective abortions, as Justice Alito mentions. But the truth is that roughly 93% of all abortions are performed in the 1st trimester. Late-term abortions are relatively rare. These abortions are usually involve desired pregnancy, and the reason women seek abortion in the late stages of the pregnancy is because of health reasons. So it's either a real risk for fetal abnormalities or some severe risks for the women's health. And as I said, the numbers are very, very small. And finally, the court decision in Dobbs belittles the significance of the right to abortion in women's life. What Justice Alito explains in the majority opinion is that women need abortion because they want to make progress in the workplace. But he forgets to mention that abortion bans lead to forced pregnancies. Forced pregnancy is one of the harshest forms of oppression. A woman who is forced to carry a pregnancy to term is denied the most basic freedom that every human being deserves. So the Dobbs decision is not simply a decision that overturned Roe v. Wade. The way I see it is an attack on truth and consequently an attack on democracy. And in an era when cynical politicians distort facts for political gains, the one place where facts must matter is the courtroom. So for reproductive rights activists, the immediate challenge after Dobbs is to make sure that abortion facts matter again. And this is not going to be an easy task. And I want to end by saying something about the future of reproductive rights at the beginning of the 21st century. And I want to start on a personal note and say that as a young woman in Israel, I wanted to have an abortion. I was pregnant. It was an unplanned and undesired pregnancy. And I was certain that I wanted an abortion. The problem was that I was already married. And as you by now know for a married woman, it's extremely difficult to get abortion approval unless you manipulate your way to legal abortion. So I manipulated my way to legal abortion. And I will never forget this sense of humiliation, the situation that you have no control over your body. You have to beg a committee of 3 strangers to give you permission to end an undesired pregnancy. Several years later, I traveled to the United States to pursue my LLM studies. It was October 1992. The court decision in Planned Parenthood versus Casey has been just announced. This was the decision that affirmed Roe versus Wade. And I remember reading for the first time both Roe and Casey, and I was so inspired by this rhetoric of rights. And I thought to myself, whatever it takes, I'm going to make sure that in Israel, abortion is similarly conceptualized as a woman's fundamental right. So this was back in 1992, and 30 years have passed. And when I look around, what I see is the spread of cruel and inhumane bans on abortion in the United States. And in Israel, we have the same old story of humiliating access to abortion services. So when I'm trying to estimate whether true equality and freedom for women could be achieved in the near future, I'm not very optimistic. And on this pessimistic note, I'm going to end and open it up for questions. Thank you very much.
Well, Noya, you have been remarkable. Already during your talk, one of the participants sent me a personal note saying you're amazing. And I can only, second that. Both in terms of the clarity, the succinct clarity, which is really exceptional, and the amazing presentation that you prepared. You have really opened our eyes. So in a minute, I'll ask you some of the questions that participants wrote on the chat. But first of all, I feel the need to make an exception in your case. Usually, I say just a few words about who the speaker is. I don't go beyond that to mention who the speaker's father is. But I feel that an exception is justified in your case. So
you're probably referring to my grandfather.
Your grandfather, of course, to your grandfather. Yes, of course. So for the old-timers and the students of Israeli politics, the name Rimalt is known, and your grandfather, Elimelech Rimalt, was one of the leaders of the Liberal Party. There was a Liberal Party at that time that was actually proud of being called liberal. They merged with the Likud, and the Likud is formally, the merged Likud is formally called the Zionist Liberal Party, though onlookers may find it difficult to recognize that element in the party's agenda. But we are not being political here. So your grandfather was a longtime Knesset member, a minister, and for the rabbis here, it may be of interest to know that he was a graduate of the rabbinic seminary in Vienna. So you have come from a relevant, impressive pedigree in this regard. The question that I wanted to pose to you is, you mentioned the rules regarding abortion and the policies, etc., but would you comment on the statistics, and specifically on the statistics of legal and extra-legal abortions? And am I right in suggesting that there is a more or less similar number of the two categories, and never in Israel's history has there been a prosecution of a woman or a doctor who performed abortion that has not been sanctioned by the committee?
So there's a big question here. How many illegal abortions are being performed? An illegal abortion meaning abortion that has been performed without committee permission, right? This is the definition for illegal abortion in Israel. The numbers are unknown. I'm familiar with this estimate saying that the number of illegal abortion equals the number of legal abortion. I must say that, I cited this figure, years ago. I now, I'm not sure about this number. I'm sure there are some illegal abortion in Israel, clearly. I spoke with some women who said to me, I'm not going to tolerate this, humiliating process. Nobody is going to give me permission on my own body. So, and it's relatively easy to find a doctor who would perform abortion, and you're totally right, no criminal prosecution. It seems that the Ministry of Health also has no interest in collecting data about the number of illegal abortion. My current estimate is we're talking on the most of several thousands. I don't think the current number equals the number of legal abortions. I also should mention that the numbers of abortions are in decline. And this is a global, not a global event, but this is happening in all developed countries, right? So with better access to contraceptives and better access to sex education, women have less unwanted pregnancy, and therefore the numbers of abortion are declining also in the United States. So generally there is a general decline, and of course some illegal abortion. Nobody knows the exact number.
Thank you. You have definitely enlightened me as well. Rabbi Adele Plotkin is asking, the poor tended to be Sfaradim, immigrants from Arab countries, and very Orthodox. So discouraging large families in these groups would de facto encourage those who wished to discriminate against these groups, particularly Sfaradim and immigrants from Arab countries. We on the ground had the distinct impression that this discrimination was intentional. And she's asking you to comment on that impression.
So clearly, unfortunately, I didn't have time to discuss this aspect of the law, but clearly, when they were talking about discouraging high birth rates among the poor, meaning Mizrahi families, there were clear racist undertones to the discussions, no wonder about it. The goal was to encourage higher birth rates among the Ashkenazi families, right? And to discourage the so-called ignorant Mizrahi family, to discourage them from having too many kids. So clearly a very racist undertone that was very prevalent at the time. So this was certainly something that was going on. But from a broader perspective, this was the thing, right? So on the one hand, they were worrying about having more Jewish children. On the other hand, they wanted to have good, nice, educated, Jewish children. So children being born to the right families. So yeah, that was part of the story when they deliberated abortion reform back in the 70s.
Now, Alan Warshaw is asking, does this abortion termination committee take into consideration if the woman is Orthodox, non-Orthodox, or secular? And in conjunction with that, could you also comment on the identity of the hospital? Namely, in Israel, some of the hospitals are identifiably Orthodox. Do they have abortion committees? How do they deal with abortion if people apply to them?
Okay, so the question whether the woman is religious or not, this is usually of no interest to the committee, right? The only question is whether her request for abortion could be fit within one of the official grounds for abortion. So this is how it works. Now, not all hospitals in Israel have abortion committees. Some pretend to have abortion committees, but in fact, these committees don't function. And they, if a woman is coming forward requesting an abortion, they would keep her waiting, not discuss her petition, her request for abortion. But the thing is that So if you want to have a permission for abortion in Israel, you need to have some prior knowledge, right? How to manipulate your way to legal abortion. And to manipulate your way is not only about lying about the true reason why you seek abortion, but it's also about knowing where to go, right? So there are some hospitals, religious hospitals, that you shouldn't go there if you're seeking an abortion, because the committee will not convene, they will create all kinds of delays in discussing your request for abortion. So this happens, but Israel is a small country. There are enough pregnancy termination committees in different hospitals. And even if you were denied by one committee, you can still go to another committee. The law doesn't restrict. I mean, you can file numerous requests for pregnancy termination. So if you are determined to have legal abortion in Israel and you are willing, as I said, to play by the rule of the games, you will get your abortion approval.
I think that's very telling. But I was really asking about the angle of the hospital, namely the opportunity, as you speak about it, to highlight the fact that there are hospitals for whom religious law overpowers the law of the state. And there was just a ruling recently regarding IVF. And the court has declared policies of an Orthodox hospital that refused to treat in vitro fertilization women who were not halachically married. So can you say something about that, and namely religion and health, as they come into play with hospitals that simply don't respect the law?
So yes, of course, you're talking about Laniado. Laniado in Netanya is a religious hospital. If I remember correctly, they don't have an abortion termination committee at all. So women just don't go there. I've also, I've been speaking with several doctors who sit in these committees. I've been also speaking to religious doctors. I heard one doctor said to me that when a woman comes before his committee, he's actually trying to convince her not to have an abortion. This is against the law. They still do it. So these things happen, of course. At the end of the days, religious hospitals are doing whatever they want. Some, not too many religious doctors are also disregarding the letter of the law. But as I said, there are enough committees in other hospitals that would approve these requests for abortion.
Now, Shmuel Yerushalmi is asking how protection on the right of women to abortion will support women from low socioeconomic and poor groups of the population.
So real access to abortion depends not only on the formal, legal recognition of the law, it also depends on public funding, right? And in that respect, Israel is doing fairly well. Once you are approved by the committee, as I said, many abortions are funded by the state. So public funding is really crucial here to make abortion accessible to especially women who come from marginal sectors of the population. And this is the reason why even before Roe versus Wade was overturned, abortions were not really accessible to a large number of women, right? For poor women and for women of color. It was really, really difficult to have access to abortion, partially because of lack of funding and, of course, very few faraway clinics, so you had to travel long distances. And when you're poor, you're not able to do it. So certainly a social network that supports the provision of abortion services is crucial for making abortion a true right that could be exercised by all women.
Carol, and I apologize, I'm not sure I can pronounce her last name correctly, Dusak or Dukak, is asking, the Dobbs decision promotes, quote, life begins at conception. Since Jews do not believe that life begins then, does that make a difference? So can you comment, you may be aware of the legal challenge that was submitted by a congregation in Florida, door to door, saying that the prohibitions or the restrictions deny them their religious freedom. Namely, it's a religious freedom issue and not just an abortion issue. So can you comment on the likelihood of such a petition to be accepted by the court, and where does the liberty of Jews to practice their different religious interpretation come into play?
So first, let me say that Dobbs is a very sophisticated judicial decision. Dobbs does not determine that the fetus is a person. And it does not determine that life begins at conception. What Dobbs determines is that there is no constitutional right to abortion, and that now states can do whatever they want. So it's basically given permission to all kinds of abortion bans, including total bans, right? These type of bans that say life start at conception, and now we are in the state of Texas, Oklahoma, wherever we are, we impose a total criminal ban on all abortion. This is possible now after Dobbs. Yes, I'm aware of this legal challenge in Florida. It raises interesting questions. I must say that it's not the first time these claims have been raised. If you read all the amicus curiae briefs that have been filed over the years by Jewish religious groups in support of abortion rights to the Supreme Court, this argument has been raised over and over again. The court never acknowledge or did something with this argument. It has some force, but I must say, I mean, I think it's terrible, right? That, you know, in our effort, in our desperate efforts to protect abortion rights, we can no longer talk about women's right to equality, about bodily autonomy, about women's basic right to personal liberty. These are the core issues. And the fact that we have to rely on religious freedom trying to protect abortion rights, I think this only shows in what a desperate position we are. And I think that the court, you know, especially with the number of conservative justice, you know, everywhere, judges everywhere, not only in the Supreme Court, they can always say, okay, maybe there is a claim here for religious freedom. But if the state determines that the fetus is a person, and the state has a compelling interest to protect fetal life, these interests might override people's right to religious liberty. So it's great the Jews in Florida are fighting, but in the current political climate, I don't see this as a potential big victory for women's rights.
Judge Peter Baxbaum points out to you, further to moving away from the focus of women's rights per se, he's referring to a recent public mass appearance by Ben Shapiro, who in his speech equated support for abortion or same-sex marriage with being anti-Israel. So you should be aware that not just religious freedom, but also Zionism and Israel are being threatened by, advocacy for abortion.
Yeah, of course, and
Yeah.
there's always this racist undertone. I mentioned Mizrahi families, but also we're all the time talking about Jews, right? So as if there are no Arabs in Israel and as if Arabs don't need abortion. So the anti-abortion debate, anti-abortion activists in Israel constantly focus on the Jewish perspective, right? It's about making sure that there are more and more Jews in Israel, completely ignoring the other minorities in Israel.
Deborah Glazer is asking, does the same system of committees apply for Christian, Druze, Muslim, etc. citizens? Are there special religious considerations for those communities?
So the short answer is yes. These committees under the law is general. It applies to everybody. If you're Jewish, Christian, Muslim, it doesn't make any difference. Every woman in Israel, irrespective of religion, has to come before a committee. And the committee can approve her request for abortion based on the same legal grounds, no distinction whatsoever.
Well, there've been quite a lively exchange on the chat while you were speaking. Clearly, you generated a lot of, interest, and quite a number of the participants commenting on how wonderful your presentation was. I'm pained to realize that you chose to end on a pessimistic note. But your pessimistic note to me and the work that we do is obviously encouraging and motivating. Namely, we may be talking about women's rights, we may be talking about abortion. So much of it does boil down to issues of the conflict of religion and state. As you pointed out, the elimination of the social clause back in 1980 was a direct result of religious pressure on the politicians that have yet once again surrendered to those pressures. So whether it is women's rights that we discuss or abortion, I hope that at least the participants in our webinars realize how important it is to join with you individually and women's rights groups in Israel and other groups that fight for the founding promise of the State of Israel in our Declaration of Independence that promised not only that Israel will be based on the precepts of liberty, justice, and peace, but also promised full equality, regardless of religion, gender, or race. So there is a lot that brings us together, and you have certainly added a few more reasons for us to be committed to that necessary struggle. It was wonderful to study with you, learn from you, and be enlightened by you. And we'll be following up with sending the recording of this, and I hope that you'll be sending me the PowerPoint presentation so we can edit to that. And we'll look forward to a future opportunity to hear you on this channel. So, toda rabba. Are there any final words you would like to offer?
I just want to thank you all for joining the discussion and for staying till the end. And of course, I'll be happy to join you on another occasion. And thank you very much, Uri, for the invitation.
Toda rabba. Shalom to you all, and we'll soon announce our next webinar.